Nobody should die by their own hand in a prison. It should never happen. If the state takes responsibility for someone, it should take responsibility for their safety and do everything to make sure that at least they stay alive. In a sense, that's the least the state can do. The suicide rate went up last year, so more men and women took their own lives last year than the previous year. And there were more instances of self-injury and more instances of violence against other people, both other prisoners and staff. It's no surprise the number of staff in prison has been cut by 40%. And the people who've gone are often the most experienced because they're the most expensive. They've been there a long time, so they're the most expensive staff, and they were encouraged to leave. And that means that the prisons are now bereft of staff and bereft of people who are experienced and have years of prison craft. So they've become much more dangerous places, much more violent, and people learn violence, they learn to take drugs, they learn self-injury in prisons. That's behaviour that people will carry on when they're released. So they will carry on self-injuring, they will carry on being violent, and they have become drug addicts whilst they're in prison. That's terrifying. I've sat and held the hand of a mother of an 18-year-old boy who'd only been in prison a couple of days when he hanged himself in his cell. He was alone in his cell all night. He was known to be at risk of suicide. He'd harmed himself in the past, and in fact he had lesions on his neck where he had tried to hang himself in the past, and yet he was left alone in his cell in a prison. No mother should ever have that happen to them. No mother should ever lose a child by suicide in a prison. That should never, ever happen. And I think the shocking thing is the complacency of ministers, because they say it's not their fault, they just shirk all responsibility for when these young people die. And I think that's disgraceful, actually. I think it's quite interesting that the minister said that we somehow manipulated the figures, which is bizarre because he gave us the figures. I can't make it up when people die. We are very cautious. I'm very, very aware that we're talking to families and staff who find it very distressing when somebody dies. So we are very careful. And I know that the Minister of Justice say they're going to release figures, but I can't see how their figures could be any different to ours. And if they are, what they're going to publish will be even worse. So we're simply commenting and interpreting the figures and presenting them back to government in a way that they should respond to with respect. Let's have some mutual respect. The thing is, I think the ministers perhaps are reacting I think they're reacting personally and emotionally. I would rather see a proper, mature, considered reaction from ministers. I've dealt with a lot of ministers and a lot of secretaries of state. I've been doing this for 25 years. And I'm surprised by how puerile the response of ministers has been over the last few months, particularly in response to the Howard League's research. I would prefer to see a response from ministers that says, yes, this is a problem, and this is what we're going to do to address it. Instead of childish attacks on a charity, name calling, it's playground stuff, and I'm surprised by the kind of the playground level of debate coming from ministers. It's not about the individuals, it's about the institution. It is possible to save lives. It is possible to help people through a crisis. It is possible to hold a hand and see somebody through a crisis. Other institutions do achieve this around the world, and our prisons are failing to do it. The number of people who take their own lives in prison is the tip of an iceberg. It's the scream for help which has gone unheard. And there are a number of different factors that for each individual does it for their own individual reasons or cries for help in their own individual way. But obviously mental health is one of the issues. Now, the Howard League has just launched a new project with the Centre for Mental Health, and we're very pleased we're going to be working together to see how we can just get rid of all suicides. I do not want anybody to die by their own hand in prison. And that is the challenge we're setting. How can that happen? What steps can the state, the Ministry of Justice, the government take to make sure that nobody dies by their own hand in prison? The messes that have been created by perhaps political decisions rather than justice decisions. So, for example, the reorganisation of the probation service, I think, has been really inept. I was talking to magistrates recently, and they said that because they're in court, they have someone in front of them who has a pre-sentence report. It's been written by somebody other than the probation officer who is standing in court. The probation officer has to defend this report that they didn't write. They've never met the person, the offender, before. And then the court has to make a decision about whether the recommendation for the sentence is reasonable, but they've got no one to question on it because of the split between probation and the community rehabilitation companies, which is now being fed in and coming on stream. So the courts know that this is a shambles. Probation service, which was a successful public service and had been for a century, has been abolished, pretty much. And that, I think, is inept on a massive scale because it's putting the public at risk. And I think, actually, Finland is a more interesting model because they made a conscious decision to change their criminal justice system. It's not just part of the Scandinavian history. It was different. It was part of the Soviet bloc. It was very repressive. It was very authoritarian and very punitive, and they had high use of prison. And they made a decision to say, we don't want to do that anymore. We want to be Scandinavian. We don't want to be Soviet anymore when the wall came down. And part of that cultural change was to reduce the use of prison. So it is possible to make decisions and to make changes. And I think that model is something we could copy.